At 23:47 on August 31st, 1939, inside the German General Staff's map room in Berlin, the night air hung still, with a dry wind whispering dust across the rooftops. Yellow light spilled from lamps onto a long wooden table, illuminating a map of Eastern Europe spread flat. Red pins marked troop positions. A young officer slid a steel ruler, positioning his pencil on the Polish border, drawing a line as fine as a thread. He knew that within hours, it would become a tear in the fabric of the continent. Further east, another line already existed, drawn in hidden ink. The secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact carved up Poland along the narrow Vistula Sand line, consigning the Baltic states and Bessarabia to the Soviet sphere of influence. These clandestine divisions were absent from public maps, residing instead in the pockets of men who would unleash destruction at dawn. At 4:45 on September 1st, 1939, west of Platt Gdansk was shrouded in sea fog, a cold wind blowing off the bay through sand and pines. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein aimed its massive 280mm guns, their barrels thick as pillars, capable of reaching targets tens of kilometers away. They opened fire, each blast seeming to lift the earth, marking the commencement of war. That first salvo sent tremors across Europe's map. Poland was invaded from the west. Across the fields of Poznan, columns of Panzer I and 2 tanks advanced. Polish 37mm Bofors anti-tank guns, at close range, snapped back, capable of piercing light armor if they struck the flank plates. But the Blitzkrieg was not a single spear. It was a deluge of air power, artillery, and trucked infantry pouring through breaches in the defenses. On September 17th, the Soviet Red Army crossed Poland's eastern border, precisely along the line dictated by the secret pact. Poland was caught in a vice. On the map, a country vanished in weeks. Historians refer to it as the fourth partition of Poland. Western areas were annexed or transformed into German general government, while eastern lands were absorbed into Soviet Belarus and Ukraine. In Lublin, a Polish postal clerk, hearing the ominous rattle of tank tracks, slipped his wedding photo inside his coat. He ran past the station, noticing 2 different flags hanging on streets separated by a mere 100 steps. He understood that maps didn't change annually. They changed hourly. As Poland was erased, other borders began to erode. Stalin turned his gaze north, seeking to expand Leningrad's buffer zone. In the winter of 1939-40, the USSR fought Finland in the Winter War, seizing a strip of Karelia and territory along the Gulf of Finland. The Soviet frontier expanded, albeit at a heavy cost in casualties. The exact numbers still debated. On a wall map in Helsinki, a Finnish medic circled villages slated for evacuation with a red pencil. Each small ring represented a home abandoned, a graveyard destined to lie beyond new border. In 1940, Hitler's pencil moved faster than the snow fell. In April, Germany attacked Denmark and Norway, Operation Weserübung, seizing the Baltic Gateway and the North Sea coast. Scandinavia's colors on the map shifted in mere weeks. In May-June, Germany overran the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Paris fell, and France was divided. The North and Atlantic coast under German occupation, the South governed by Vichy. Borders retained their names, but sovereignty was sliced like bread. A French soldier retreated across a bridge over the Somme, clutching a letter from his wife. He had just read "Come Home" when Stuka screamed down from the sky. He dove into a shallow trench, barely 1-to-1. 2 meters deep, the earth still damp. He survived. The bridge behind him exploded. When he looked back, the France on his map was no longer the France of yesterday. The Mediterranean map, too, began to transform. Italy entered the war in June 1940, extending the front to North Africa and the Balkans. At this stage, the question was not yet who would win, but that the war's boundaries had spread from Eastern Europe across Western Europe and southward, turning Europe into a vast gray zone of occupation. In Asia, new strokes awaited. Japan had been at war with China since 1937. In September 1940, Japan occupied northern French Indochina. In July 1941, it moved into southern Indochina, creating a springboard into Southeast Asia. On the map of East Asia, Japan's influence darkened, spreading like ink through paper. In Hanoi, a French colonial official watched Japanese troops march by, their hobnail boots sounding ominously regular. He opened his desk to reveal an old map of Indochina. He didn't know how to redraw it, because he was no longer the one holding the pencil. By the end of 1940, the world map had tilted on both hemispheres. Poland vanished, partitioned by Germany and the USSR. Germany occupied most of Western and Northern Europe. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and much of Central Europe. The USSR expanded its buffer zone after Poland and the Winter War. Japan entrenched itself in Indochina, preparing to advance further across Asia. This marked the first crest. The map was being stretched by preliminary cuts, partitioning Poland, seizing Scandinavia and France, and anchoring Indochina. Borders hadn't yet fully collapsed, but they were already scored, awaiting the next violent push. At 5:36 on June 28, 1940, at a Prut river crossing outside Iași, Romania, summer heat already rose from the fields. The river was low, a muddy green, flowing sluggishly. A Soviet column appeared through the dust. Infantry in gray-green uniforms, rattling trucks, and T-26 tanks clanking at the front. Their 45mm guns pointed forward. Their effective anti-tank range was roughly 500 to 800 meters in real combat, longer on paper. The ultimatum had been delivered 2 days prior. Now, the border was being forcibly redrawn. Between June 28 and early July, the USSR occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. On the map, Romania's eastern edge caved in, not by grand battle, but by political shove. A rail clerk in Chisinau, fictional, feeling the floor shake from tank tracks, folded his stamped ledger and slipped a family photo under the counter. His city changed color without his consent. His job title, his language at work, even the names on street corners would change within weeks. The border transformed from a line into a moving blade. 200 kilometers northwest, another set of blades was already moving toward the Baltic. At 12:20 on June 17, 1940, in Tallinn Harbor, the sky was pale, the wind sharp off the Gulf of Finland. Soviet cruisers loomed like iron buoys. Red Army troops marched into the capital the same day Estonia was forced to accept occupation and a new government. Latvia and Lithuania followed in June. By August, the 3 states were annexed into USSR. On the world map, 3 small republics vanished into a larger shade of red. The shift was accomplished with staged elections and bayonets behind the scenes. The legal framing remains disputed. The fact of occupation and annexation does not. A Lithuanian teacher, fictional, watched Soviet tanks idling near Kaunas railway station. She held a class photo, its edges already bent. She didn't concern herself with ideology. She knew only the timetable for evacuating families. 1 suitcase each. Trains departing at dawn. The map changed not as a headline, but as a list of names read aloud. Across Europe, Hitler's color spread faster than anyone could reprint atlases. France had fallen days earlier. Scandinavia was already gray. The continent was now an occupied slab stretching from Narvik down to Bordeaux. But in early 1941, the map wasn't yet finished. The Axis needed the Balkans secure for oil routes and for the coming Eastern offensive, so the pencil turned south. At 4:58 on April 6, 1941, in Belgrade, spring fog hung low over the Sava River. Wind snaked through streets before shops opened. Stukas dived in screaming arcs, their sirens designed to terrorize as much as to aim. Bombs slammed down in wide patterns. Within 11 days, Yugoslavia surrendered and was partitioned among Germany, Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria, and collaborators. Greece was invaded concurrently, and by June 1, 1941, all of Greece and Yugoslavia were under Axis control. The Balkan Peninsula on the map changed in a single breath. Kingdoms dissolved, occupation zones sketched, puppet states installed. In a basement near Terazide Square, a Serbian boy clutched a harmonica. His mother hushed him as plastered dust fell. The boy heard the siren and mistook it for a train. He blew one shaky note, which was swallowed by a second explosion. when they crawled out later. The street signs were still in Serbian, but the city was already colored by someone else's regime. The Axis map now appeared solid. Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, France, the Balkans, much of Central Europe, plus Italy's imperial claims in North Africa and Japan's expanding grip in Asia. Yet, the chaotic layer of the map wasn't solely Axis expansion. It also encompassed the unstable alliance between the Axis and the USSR, an alliance that was already fraying. On the night of June 21st, 1941, in a rail yard near Lublin in occupied Poland, the air was hot and metallic. Panzer trains idled under blackout lamps. Tank crews slapped the sides of their turrets as if waking slumbering beasts. Panzer III and IV guns pointed east. 50 millimeters and short 75 millimeters barrels in early models, with effective anti-armor ranges generally around 1 kilometer for the 50 millimeters, less for the short 75 against tanks. Trucks loaded artillery shells. German 105 millimeters howitzers could fire roughly 4 to 6 rounds per minute per gun in sustained bursts. The officers didn't say map. They said phase line, but they meant the same thing. The border was about to move again. At 3:15 on June 22, 1941, the Soviet frontier ignited. Operation Barbarossa tore through the line the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had drawn. In hours, the map flipped twice. The USSR, yesterday co-partition of Poland, became invaded territory. The Axis, yesterday focused west and south, transformed into a continental east-driving machine. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, annexed a year earlier into USSR, were overrun by Germany within weeks. Along the Bug River, a Soviet border platoon crouched in trenches barely 1-to-1. 5 meters deep, their new frontier fortifications incomplete, according to some sources. German artillery carpeted the crest line. Infantry poured across bridges. The Red Army lost entire armies in encirclements. Hundreds of thousands were captured in the summer-fall of 1941. Exact totals vary by source. The scale of the disaster does not. This was the most violent kind of cartography. Borders erased by shells. A young Soviet signalman, fictional, in a half-collapsed bunker fumbled with a field phone. No line. He reached for a whistle, blowing 2 sharp blasts. The emergency retreat signal. The men beside him didn't ask for a map. They felt it tilting beneath their boots. Meanwhile, the Asian map was shifting toward the same convergence. In July 1941, Saigon and Hanoi were saturated with humid monsoon air. The roads glistened. Japanese troops entered southern French Indochina after occupying the north in September 1940, transforming it into a launch pad toward Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. The Pacific map darkened with Japanese bases, airfields, and supply lines. Every new airstrip was a dot of ink that would soon connect into a thrust. By late 1941, the world map had become a storm of overlapping colors and collapsing borders. Eastern Europe was split, then resplit. Poland erased. The Baltics annexed by the USSR in 1940, then occupied by Germany in 1941. The USSR expanded to Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in June-July 1940, pushing its frontier southwest. The Balkans were conquered and partitioned by the Axis in April-June 1941. Japan completed its Indochina foothold by July 1941, setting the Pacific chessboard. This was the second crest. The map was no longer changing solely by campaigns, but by chasing momentum, ultimatums, occupations, puppet borders, surprise invasions. Governments fell, flags were swapped, and entire regions changed legal identities while people slept. The world was being redrawn faster than it could be understood. At 3:58 on December 5, 1941, on the edge of the Moskva River west of Moscow, snow fell sideways in hard needles. Pines stood as black silhouettes. The ground was iron frozen. German infantry lay in foxholes only a meter deep, scraped into frozen clay with bayonets and entrenching tools that sparked on stone. Their breath turned into white smoke under helmet rims. They had marched from Minsk to Smolensk to the gates of Moscow. Now, the map they carried in June no longer matched the land before them. A flare went up. Soviet artillery answered in a sudden, deafening barrage. 2 mm divisional guns and 122 mm howitzers fired in rippling salvos. Train crews could sustain several rounds per minute, creating a density that turned tree lines into splinters. Rates vary by model and crew. This is a general sustained fire reality. German troops pressed their faces into the snow. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5th to 6th. The Wehrmacht, which had been redrawing borders by force since 1939, was forced to step back. The eastern map ceased expanding and began to bleed. In the frozen trench, a German corporal fictional pulled out a postcard from Paris, dated July 1940. The Eiffel Tower still stood in the photo. He stared at it as if it belonged to another century. A whistle shrieked. Zurück. Back. The order was short, sharp, and humiliating. The map in his pocket had arrows pointing east. His boots were now heading west. This was one axis of the 1939, the 41 world map, snapping into a new shape. The other axis was about to snap in the Pacific. At 7:48 on December 7th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor, Oahu, the morning was clear, the air warm, the water still. Then, Japanese aircraft screamed in. Torpedo bombers skimmed low and dropped Type 91 torpedoes, built to run shallow. Bombs followed in steep dives. The attack detonated more than ships. It detonated American neutrality. Within hours, the Pacific map exploded outward. By 3 o'clock on December 8th, local time across Asia, Japan launched near-simultaneous assaults on the Philippines, Guam, Wake, Hong Kong, and British Malaya, and began the drive toward the Dutch East Indies. The purpose was blunt: seize oil, rubber, tin, and build a defensive perimeter, as standard campaign summaries state. On the map, this meant new red lines slashing across sea lanes and island chains. At 5:12 on December 10th, 1941, off the coast of Malaya, monsoon clouds hung low. The sea was choppy gray-green. 2 British capital ships, Prince of Wales and Repulse, tried to flee air attack. Japanese land-based bombers and torpedo planes struck repeatedly. Torpedoes hit. The ships capsized and sank, widely recorded event. The old imperial shield in Southeast Asia cracked in a single morning. Malaya and Singapore were now exposed. The map of British control was about to fold. In Manila, a Filipino nurse, fictional, ripped hospital sheets into bandages. She heard air raid sirens and the thud of bombs on the port. She had no atlas. She knew only that Japanese troops were landing, and the city's name on the world map was about to reside inside someone else's borders. The Philippines campaign would cost roughly 100,000 Filipino and American soldiers killed or captured in its early phase. Numbers like that are how maps change when people don't want them to. In Europe, while Japan expanded, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941. The conflict became officially global. The map was no longer a patchwork of theaters. It was one connected fire. So, what did the world map look like by the end of 1941? Europe and North Africa. Germany held a massive, continuous occupation zone. Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, France's North and Atlantic coast, much of Central Europe, Yugoslavia and Greece in Axis partition zones. Italy controlled Libya and parts of the Balkans on paper, but was increasingly dependent on German force. The USSR, after its 1939-40 expansions, eastern Poland, the Baltics, Bessarabia, northern Bukovina, had been driven back hard in 1941. Germany occupied the Baltics, Belarus, much of Ukraine, and reached the outskirts of Leningrad and Moscow. Yet, the Soviet winter counteroffensive halted the Axis tide and pushed the front line west of Moscow. On the map, the line of German advance froze for the first time. Asia, Pacific. Japan had transformed Indochina into a launch pad. Then in December 1941 began a cascade of conquests. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Guam, Wake, and the open assaults toward the Dutch East Indies. The Pacific map turned into a fan of Japanese arrows aimed at resources and strategic choke points. This was the third crest. The first 2 crests were expansion and chaos. The third was reversal plus totalization. In the east of Europe, Axis momentum broke against winter and Soviet depth. In the Pacific, Japanese momentum erupted into a new oceanic empire. At the same time, the U.S. entered and stitched the theaters together. The map didn't just change. It locked into a global war geometry. A small human hinge sat right at that lock. On the evening of December 11th, 1941, at a train station in Iowa, snow tapped the platform. A young American recruit, fictional, kissed a folded photo of his parents before boarding. He wasn't thinking about Bessarabia or the Bug River. He was thinking about Pearl Harbor, about a world map that had suddenly become his problem. He stepped onto a train that would lead to a ship, then to a continent he had never seen. The borderlines of Europe and Asia now ran through his life. Strategic consequence. By late 1941, Axis territorial reach was near its early high tide, but it was uneven. Germany's empire in Europe was vast yet overextended and now checked in the USSR. Japan's empire in Asia was growing fast, but would soon face American industrial weight. The map of 1939 to 41 therefore set the basic battlefield for the rest of World War II. A Europe mostly occupied by Germany with a still-alive Soviet core, and a Pacific suddenly reorganized around Japanese expansion and U.S. entry. Legacy. The 1939 to 41 redrawing planted seeds for the post-1945 world. Poland's disappearance and later restoration, the Baltics annexation, and the memory of it. The brutal frontier shift in Ukraine and Belarus, and Japan's short-lived Greater East Asia perimeter all became templates for how power can reshape geography at speed, and for why smaller nations fear secret protocols and surprise landings. Moscow's snow swallowing German arrows, and the Pacific's warm water swallowing American ships. Between those two climates, the world map of 1939 to 41 completed its transformation from paper borders into a living, bleeding front line that would define everything that followed.